June 18th, 1982, 7:25 in the morning. Under Blackfriars Bridge in London, a construction worker noticed something hanging from the scaffolding. At first, he thought it was a bundle of clothes. Then he looked closer. It was a body. A man in an expensive suit, pockets stuffed with bricks and cash, hanging by an orange rope, his feet dangling just above the Thames River. The dead man was Roberto Calvi, chairman of Italy's largest private bank, known in financial circles as God's banker because of his deep connections to the Vatican. In his pockets, investigators found $15,000 in 3 different currencies. His briefcase, discovered nearby, contained documents that would shake the Catholic Church to its core. Bank statements, wire transfer records, coded ledgers detailing transactions between the Vatican Bank and shell companies in Panama, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas. The official verdict was suicide. But forensic experts who examined the evidence said that was impossible. The knots were wrong. The bricks were arranged too carefully. Calvi's hands showed no traces of the orange paint that should have transferred from the rope. This wasn't suicide. It was murder, and the reason he was killed was because he knew too much about the Vatican's secret financial empire. An empire built on money laundering, tax evasion, and deals with some of the most dangerous men in Europe. This is the story of how the Catholic Church became one of the world's wealthiest institutions, how it built a bank that operated above the law, and how a scandal involving murder, the mafia, and missing billions nearly brought it all crashing down. This is the story of the banker who bet against God. To understand how the Vatican became a financial superpower, we need to go back to 1870, the year Italy unified and the Pope lost his temporal power. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had controlled vast territories. The papal states stretched across central Italy. Popes commanded armies, collected taxes, ruled as both spiritual and political leaders. But Italian unification changed everything. The new government seized church lands, dissolved papal territories, confined the Pope to Vatican City, 110 acres surrounded by Rome. The church was humiliated, powerless, and broke. Then, in 1929, something changed. Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, signed the Lateran Treaty with Pope Pius XI. The agreement was simple. Italy would recognize Vatican City as an independent sovereign state. In exchange, the church would receive compensation for the land seized in 1870. The payment was $92 million in 1929 currency, equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. Suddenly, the Vatican had money, lots of it. The question was, what to do with it? Pope Pius XI made a decision that would define Vatican finances for the next century. He created a special department to manage the church's wealth. They called it the Institute for the Works of Religion, but everyone else called it by a simpler name, the Vatican Bank. And here's where things get interesting. Because the Vatican Bank wasn't like other banks, it didn't have to follow the same rules. As a sovereign entity, Vatican City wasn't subject to Italian banking regulations, or international banking laws, or really, any oversight at all. It was the perfect vehicle for moving money, quietly, secretly, without questions. By the 1950s, the Vatican Bank had become a financial powerhouse. It invested in Italian corporations, bought real estate across Europe, acquired stakes in banks, insurance companies, pharmaceutical firms. The church that preached poverty had become one of the richest institutions on earth. But wealth attracts attention, and attention attracts less savory characters. In 1968, a charismatic Italian financier named Michele Sindona approached the Vatican. He had connections, he had ideas, and he promised he could make the church even richer. Sindona was brilliant, a self-made millionaire who'd built a financial empire through aggressive investing and creative accounting. He owned banks in Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. He had relationships with major corporations, and investigators would later discover he had deep ties to the Sicilian Mafia. The Vatican Bank put Sindona in charge of managing hundreds of millions in church assets. He invested in Italian banks, currency speculation, real estate development. The returns were spectacular. For a while. Then, in 1974, Sindona's empire collapsed. His banks failed. Investigations revealed massive fraud, money laundering, connections to organized crime. He fled to the United States to avoid prosecution. But before he left, Sindona introduced Vatican officials to someone who would become even more important, even more dangerous, a protege who'd learned everything Sindona knew about offshore banking and financial secrecy. His name was Roberto Calvi. Roberto Calvi was different from Sindona, quieter, more cautious, less flashy. He didn't seek attention. He avoided cameras, rarely gave interviews. But behind the scenes, Calvi was building something extraordinary, a financial network that stretched across continents. A web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and secret transactions designed to move money invisibly. At the center of this network was Banco Ambrosiano, an Italian bank with deep Catholic roots, named after Saint Ambrose, patron saint of Milan. Calvi became chairman in 1975, and almost immediately he began working closely with the Vatican Bank. Here's how the scheme worked, and it was brilliant in its complexity. Calvi would create shell companies in tax havens: Panama, Luxembourg, the Bahamas, Nicaragua. These companies existed only on paper. They had no employees, no offices, just bank accounts and holding structures. Then, Banco Ambrosiano would loan money to these shell companies. Hundreds of millions of dollars. The loans were documented, legal, reported to regulators. But here's the key. The shell companies would then transfer that money to the Vatican Bank, which would invest it in various ventures: real estate, stocks, other banks. When those investments made money, the profits would flow back through the shell companies to Banco Ambrosiano. On paper, everything looked legitimate. Banco Ambrosiano was making loans to seemingly independent companies. Those companies were paying interest. The bank was profitable. In reality, Calvi was using the Vatican Bank to hide money, evade taxes, move capital out of Italy in violation of currency controls, and probably launder money for organized crime. Documents obtained decades later through Italian court proceedings revealed the scale of the operation. Between 1977 and 1982, over $1.4 billion flowed through this network. $1.4 billion. The Vatican Bank's role was crucial, because as a sovereign entity, it didn't have to disclose its operations. Italian regulators couldn't audit it. International banking authorities had no jurisdiction. It was a black box. Money went in. Money came out. What happened inside was a mystery. And the man running the Vatican Bank during this period was an American archbishop named Paul Marcinkus, a 6'4" former bodyguard to the Pope, a man with no formal banking training, but someone Vatican officials trusted completely. Marcinkus and Calvi became close, very close. Calvi would visit Vatican City regularly, meet with Marcinkus in offices overlooking St. Peter's Square. They'd discuss investments, strategies, how to move money more efficiently. But investigators later discovered something darker. Letters between Calvi and Marcinkus that suggested the Vatican Bank wasn't just facilitating these transactions, it was guaranteeing them. If the shell companies couldn't pay back the loans, the Vatican Bank would cover the losses. At least, that's what Calvi claimed. He had letters, later called letters of comfort, that seemed to commit the Vatican to backing Banco Ambrosiano's offshore operations. The Vatican would later deny these letters had any legal force, but Calvi believed otherwise, and he used those letters to borrow even more aggressively. By 1982, Banco Ambrosiano had over $3 billion in outstanding loans, most of it to shell companies connected to the Vatican Bank. And increasingly, auditors and regulators were asking questions. Where was this money really going? Who owned these shell companies? Why were the loans structured so opaquely? The Italian central bank launched an investigation. Prosecutors began looking into Calvi's operations. The Bank of Italy revoked his passport, preventing him from leaving the country. Calvi panicked. He knew what investigators would find if they dug deep enough. He knew the network he'd built would unravel, and he knew that when it did, powerful people would be exposed. So he did something desperate. He gathered the most incriminating documents, stuffed them in a briefcase, and in June 1982, he fled Italy. He traveled to Austria, then London, meeting with associates, trying to secure emergency funding, attempting to cover the holes in Banco Ambrosiano's balance sheet before regulators discovered how bad things really were. It didn't work. On June 18th, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. The biggest bank failure in Italian history. Over $1 billion. Missing. Simply gone. And that same morning, Roberto Calvi was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge. The death of Roberto Calvi sent shockwaves through the financial world and raised immediate questions. If this was murder, and forensic evidence strongly suggested it was, who killed him? And why? The initial investigation was a disaster. London police treated it as a suicide. The scene wasn't properly secured. Evidence was contaminated. Key witnesses weren't interviewed thoroughly. But Italian prosecutors didn't buy the suicide theory. They believed Calvi was killed to prevent him from revealing secrets. Secrets about where Banco Ambrosiano's money had really gone, and who was involved. Over the next 2 decades, Italian investigators would uncover a story more complex and disturbing than anyone imagined. They discovered that Calvi hadn't just been working with the Vatican Bank. He'd also been moving money for Propaganda Due, a secret Masonic lodge with deep connections to Italian intelligence, the military, and organized crime. P2, as it was called, had infiltrated the highest levels of Italian government. Among its members, generals, politicians, journalists, business leaders, and according to membership lists seized in police raids, several high-ranking Vatican officials. The organization's goal was to create a shadow government, control Italy from behind the scenes, and they needed money to do it. Lots of money. Calvi had been their banker, but there was more. Investigators found evidence that Calvi had also been laundering money for the Sicilian Mafia. The shell companies in Panama weren't just for tax evasion. They were routing drug money, proceeds from smuggling operations, cash that needed to be cleaned before it could be invested in legitimate businesses. And some of that money had flowed through the Vatican Bank. The implications were staggering. The Catholic Church, willingly or not, had become part of an international criminal network. Its bank had enabled money laundering, tax fraud, possibly even arms trafficking and terrorism financing. When Italian prosecutors demanded access to Vatican Bank records to trace the missing $1 billion, Vatican officials refused. They cited sovereignty, claimed the bank's operations were confidential, said they couldn't be compelled to cooperate with Italian authorities. This created a bizarre standoff. A major financial crime had been committed. Evidence was locked inside Vatican City, and Italian law enforcement had no way to access it. The scandal threatened to engulf the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II, who'd only been in office a few years, faced the worst crisis of his papacy. Calls for transparency, demands for accountability, questions about whether Vatican officials had knowingly participated in criminal activity. Let me tell you about Clara Calvi, Roberto's daughter. When her father died, Clara was 29 years old. She'd always known he worked in banking, that he traveled frequently, that he seemed stressed in the months before his death. But she didn't know the details, didn't understand the complexity of what he'd been doing, didn't realize the danger he was in. The day her father's body was found, Clara's life changed forever. Not just because she'd lost her father, but because she suddenly became a target. Anonymous phone calls, threats, cars following her. She was told to stop asking questions about how her father died, to accept the suicide verdict, to let it go. She refused. For the next 3 decades, Clara Calvi fought for the truth. She hired private investigators, demanded new inquiries, pushed Italian prosecutors to treat her father's death as murder rather than suicide. Her home was broken into multiple times. Nothing valuable was taken, just files, documents, anything related to her father's death or his work. In 2005, after years of pressure, Italian authorities finally opened a murder investigation. 5 people were charged with Calvi's killing, 4 mafia members and a Rome businessman with ties to organized crime. The trial revealed shocking details. Prosecutors presented evidence that the mafia had ordered Calvi's execution because he'd lost their money in the Banco Ambrosiano collapse. The murder was meant to send a message. No one steals from the mob and lives. But the trial also raised more questions than it answered. Who ordered the hit? Who paid for it? Were there other conspirators beyond the 5 men charged? The trial ended in acquittal. Insufficient evidence. Key witnesses had died or disappeared. Documents had been destroyed. After 25 years, too much time had passed. The truth had been buried too deep. Clara was devastated, but she didn't stop. She continued investigating, writing, speaking publicly about her father's case and the Vatican's role in the scandal. In her book, published in 2003, Clara made a bold claim. Her father hadn't been killed by the Mafia alone. It was a coordinated operation. The mob pulled the trigger, but others, powerful figures in Italian society, possibly within the Vatican itself, had wanted her father silenced. The Vatican never responded to these allegations, never addressed Clara's claims, never opened their archives to allow independent investigation. To this day, Clara Calvi believes her father was murdered to protect secrets about money, power, and the unholy alliance between the world's holiest institution and the criminal underworld. She's now in her 70s, still fighting, still demanding answers, still believing that somewhere, in some Vatican archive, documents exist that would explain everything. She'll probably never see them. The Vatican's financial records remain sealed, protected by sovereignty, hidden behind ancient walls. But here's what investigators eventually discovered. Here's the twist that makes this story even more disturbing. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal wasn't an aberration. It wasn't one corrupt banker manipulating an innocent institution. It was a symptom of how the Vatican Bank had operated for decades. When forensic accountants finally gained limited access to some Vatican financial records in the 1990s, they found a pattern. The Calvi operation was just one of many questionable relationships. The Vatican Bank had accounts for dictators, criminals, arms dealers. Anyone with money, regardless of how they'd acquired it, could open an account. No questions asked, no due diligence performed, complete secrecy guaranteed. One investigative journalist, following the money trail, discovered that the Vatican Bank had held accounts for Augusto Pinochet, Chilean dictator responsible for thousands of deaths, managers of cartels moving cocaine from South America, arms traffickers supplying weapons to conflict zones, politicians evading taxes in their home countries. The bank's secrecy laws made it the perfect vehicle for hiding wealth. Better than Swiss banks, better than Panama, because the Vatican could claim religious protection. Any investigation could be framed as an attack on the Catholic Church. And there was another revelation. Something even the most cynical investigators hadn't expected. Documents leaked by a Vatican whistleblower in 2012 revealed that the bank had been chronically mismanaged. Money was missing. Accounts didn't balance. Some deposits had simply disappeared, vanished into a labyrinth of internal transfers and unexplained withdrawals. Pope Benedict XVI, who took office in 2005, tried to reform the system. He brought in external auditors, hired compliance officers, attempted to make the Vatican Bank transparent. He failed. The resistance from within was too strong. Too many powerful Vatican officials benefited from the current system. Too many secrets needed to stay buried. In 2012, Benedict took an unprecedented step. He fired the Vatican Bank's president and suspended several top officials. He announced a comprehensive review of all accounts. Any that couldn't be properly documented would be closed. The backlash was intense. Within months, leaked documents, later called Vatileaks, began appearing in Italian media. Private papal correspondence, internal memos, financial records. Someone inside the Vatican was sabotaging the reform effort. 1 year later, Benedict resigned, the first pope to voluntarily leave office in 600 years. He cited age and declining health. But Vatican insiders whispered about other reasons. The resistance to reform had made his position untenable. His successor, Pope Francis, continued the reform efforts. But progress has been slow. The culture of secrecy runs deep. And powerful interests, both inside and outside the Vatican, want to keep it that way. So what does all this mean? What are the implications of a church bank that operated like a criminal enterprise? First, there's the moral dimension. The Catholic Church teaches its followers about honesty, transparency, justice. Yet its own financial institution violated all those principles for decades. This hypocrisy has cost the church credibility, particularly in Europe, where the Banco Ambrosiano scandal became a symbol of institutional corruption. Church attendance declined, donations dropped, trust evaporated. But there's a broader implication about sovereignty and accountability. The Vatican's status as an independent state gives it unique protections. It doesn't have to comply with international banking regulations, doesn't participate in information sharing agreements, can refuse cooperation with foreign law enforcement. This creates a loophole, a way for money to disappear. And in an interconnected global financial system, loopholes like this undermine everyone's security. Money laundering doesn't just hurt the countries where crimes are committed. It destabilizes entire economies, funds terrorism, enables corruption. The Vatican Bank's secrecy made all of that easier. Since 2010, under pressure from the European Union and international banking authorities, the Vatican has implemented reforms. It joined international anti-money laundering conventions, created an internal financial watchdog, published annual reports on the bank's activities. But skeptics question whether these reforms are genuine or cosmetic. The Vatican Bank still operates with more secrecy than most financial institutions, still refuses to fully open its archives, still protects certain accounts from scrutiny, and the fundamental question remains unanswered. How much wealth does the Vatican really control? Estimates vary wildly. The Vatican itself claims limited assets, mainly real estate and art collections worth a few $billion. Independent analysts suggest the true figure is much higher, perhaps tens of billions, maybe more. No one knows for certain, because the Vatican doesn't have to disclose its complete financial position, and probably never will. There's also the question of justice. The people responsible for the Banco Ambrosiano scandal were never fully held accountable. Some died, some were acquitted, some simply walked away. Archbishop Marcinkus, the American who ran the Vatican Bank during the Calvi era, was named in Italian arrest warrants for fraud and complicity in the bank's collapse. But he never faced trial. He remained inside Vatican City, protected by diplomatic immunity, until the statute of limitations expired. He died in 2006, never prosecuted, never punished. The missing $1 billion from Banco Ambrosiano was never recovered. The shell companies that held it were dissolved. The money trail went cold. Italian depositors who lost their savings in the bank's collapse received only partial restitution. The Vatican eventually paid $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors. It called the payment a voluntary contribution, rather than an admission of liability. A gesture of goodwill, not accountability. But that payment raised another question. If the Vatican wasn't responsible for the bank's collapse, why did it pay anything? And if it was responsible, why didn't it pay everything? The answer, investigators believe, is that the Vatican knew it was culpable, knew that its bank had enabled fraud. But admitting full responsibility would open the door to more claims, more investigations, more revelations about other questionable operations. So it paid enough to make the immediate problem go away, and hoped time would erase the rest. June 18th, 1982. Roberto Calvi hanging under a bridge in London, pockets full of bricks and cash, briefcase full of secrets. That image haunts the history of Vatican finance, a symbol of what happens when religious institutions prioritize wealth over values, when secrecy becomes more important than accountability, when the pursuit of money corrupts the pursuit of faith. The banker who bet against God wasn't Calvi. He was just a player in a larger game. The real bet was made by the institution itself. The Vatican chose to build a financial empire in the shadows, to operate without oversight, to protect its wealth above all else. And for decades, that bet paid off. The Vatican Bank grew. The church's assets multiplied. Those who asked uncomfortable questions were ignored or silenced. But the Banco Ambrosiano scandal exposed the cost of that bet, revealed that secrecy enables corruption, that even holy institutions can be captured by criminal interests, that walls around Vatican City don't just keep outsiders out, they keep darkness in. Pope Francis has spoken often about financial reform, about transparency and accountability, about the church serving the poor rather than accumulating wealth. These are beautiful words, important principles. But changing an institution as old and complex as the Vatican is nearly impossible. Too many entrenched interests, too many secrets that powerful people want to keep buried. Too much history that would be embarrassing, or worse, if fully revealed. Clara Calvi is still alive, still searching for complete truth about her father's death, still believing that documents exist somewhere in Vatican archives that would answer her questions. She'll probably die without getting those answers, because the Vatican's commitment to secrecy remains stronger than its commitment to transparency. The archives will stay closed, the documents will stay hidden, the full story will never be told. And the Vatican Bank continues operating, reformed, supposedly, more transparent, allegedly, but still enjoying special status, still protected by sovereignty, still able to hide information that other financial institutions must disclose. The scandal of God's banker should have changed everything, should have forced the Catholic Church to fundamentally reimagine its relationship with money, to choose spiritual authority over financial power. It didn't. The system adapted, became more careful, more sophisticated, but the basic structure remained intact, because institutions, even religious ones, rarely reform themselves voluntarily. Change comes only when external pressure becomes unbearable, when the cost of secrecy exceeds the benefit, when hiding becomes more dangerous than revealing. The Vatican hasn't reached that point. Not yet. The reforms of the past 15 years have been enough to quiet international criticism, to restore enough credibility, to make the problem seem solved. But beneath the surface, the questions linger. How much wealth does the Vatican really control? Where did all the money go? Who profited from decades of secrecy? What other scandals remain hidden behind those ancient walls? Roberto Calvi knew the answers. He carried them in his briefcase that June morning in London. He thought that knowledge would protect him, thought he could leverage those secrets to survive. He was wrong. The secrets got him killed. And 40 years later, those secrets are still buried, still protected, still hidden behind sovereignty and sacred walls. The banker who bet against God lost everything. But the institution he served kept its secrets. And in the world of Vatican finance, keeping secrets is the only bet that matters. The empire remains, built on money that came from places no one talks about, protected by laws that shield it from scrutiny, operating in shadows that even the light of scandal couldn't fully illuminate. This is the story of how the Catholic Church built one of the world's richest banks, how it became entwined with criminals and conspirators, how scandal nearly exposed everything. Nearly, but not quite. Because in the end, the walls held. The secrets stayed secret, and the Vatican Bank survived to operate another day. God's banker is dead, but the empire he helped build lives on.